Lettice Harrow did not walk into that ballroom. She was pushed. Her stepmother's hand was firm against her back, and the message in it was not subtle. Smile, stand straight, and do not embarrass this family tonight. The Henwick name had been carrying debt for 2 years, and every soul in that room knew it. Lettice knew it too, which was exactly why she had been avoiding mirrors all evening. The Duke of Greyfeld was already there, standing near the far window with a kind of stillness that made people nervous. He was not watching the dancing. He was watching the door. And the moment Lettice stumbled through it, graceless and unprepared, something in his expression shifted just slightly enough for his closest friend, Lord Bastwick, to notice and raise an eyebrow. Nobody else saw it, but Lord Bastwick saw everything. Here is what I want to know from you before this story truly begins. Have you ever walked into a room already feeling like the wrong choice? Only for someone unexpected to look at you like you were the only right thing in it? Tell me in the comments. And drop the beautiful part of the world you are watching from, because this community is growing. And I love knowing where you are. If this hook already has you curious about what the Duke saw in that doorway, subscribe now, because the full story will genuinely surprise you, and I will personally be replying to comments. Lettice Harrow had exactly 3 minutes before the entire room noticed her. She knew this because Lord Bastwick was already leaning toward the gentleman beside him, lips moving behind a gloved hand, eyes cutting sideways in her direction. The gentleman he was speaking to followed his gaze. Then another did. Then a woman near the refreshment table tilted her head, and that single movement was enough to start a quiet current of whispers moving through the ballroom like wind through tall grass. Lettice kept walking. Her stepmother, Countess Henwick, had released her arm the moment they crossed the threshold, which meant Lettice was now entirely on her own in a room full of people who had already decided what she was worth. The gown she wore had belonged to her late mother, altered twice and pressed until the fabric nearly gave up. It was not the newest style. It was not the most fashionable cut. Every woman in that ballroom could see that, and every woman in that ballroom made sure Lettice felt it. She moved toward the edge of the room, because the edge was safer. The edge meant fewer eyes, fewer whispers, fewer daughters of earls pretending not to stare. She found a position near a tall marble column, and stood there with her hands folded and her chin level, because her father had taught her one thing before illness took him from her. Never let them see you fold. The ballroom belonged to Lady Pembroke that evening. Not the Lady Pembroke everyone had been expecting to see, the one with the sharp tongue and sharper opinions. But her daughter-in-law, the younger Lady Pembroke, who had recently inherited the responsibility of hosting the county's most watched social event of the season. She had done it grandly. Candles filled every inch of ceiling height. The orchestra was imported. The flowers were fresh from a London arrangement house, and the guest list had been constructed like a weapon. Every name chosen with specific social intention. The Duke of Greyfeld's name was at the top of it. Lettice had heard his name in every conversation for the past 2 weeks. At the market, at church, in her stepmother's dressing room, where Countess Henwick spent long mornings rehearsing things to say to men of rank. The Duke of Greyfeld was 31 years old, unmarried, and in possession of an estate so large that 3 families could live comfortably on its outer land alone. He had been away from the county for 4 years, something about business in Edinburgh, and then a long silence that nobody could fully explain, and now he was back, and every unmarried woman within 20 miles had been told, in one way or another, to be present tonight. Daphne Henwick, Lettice's stepsister, had spent 6 days preparing. Lettice had spent 6 days trying to find a reason not to come. She had not found one strong enough, which was how she ended up against this column, watching Daphne glide across the room in the direction of Lord Bastwick, with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment in a mirror. Daphne was beautiful in the way that required maintenance. She was calculated and careful, and she knew exactly which angle of her face caught the most flattering light. Lettuce did not hold this against her. They had never been close enough for Lettuce to hold anything against her. Not truly. They shared a house and a surname and very little else. The orchestra shifted into a slower piece. Lettuce looked toward the main entrance without meaning to. The Duke of Greyfeld walked in, and the room responded the way rooms respond to someone they have been waiting for. Not loudly, not with applause or exclamation. Just with that particular, collective stillness that falls over a crowd when the thing they have been anticipating finally arrives. Conversations dropped half a sentence. Heads turned. Even the candles seemed to lean slightly in his direction, though that was obviously the draft from the open doors. He was tall, which Lettuce had expected from the stories. He was composed, which she had also expected. What she had not expected was how entirely unbothered he seemed by the attention pressing in around him from every direction. Most men who carried that kind of rank wore it visibly. Like a coat, they were always adjusting. This one wore it the way a person wears their own skin, without thinking about it, without performing it. He spoke briefly to Lord Bastwick near the entrance. Bastwick said something that made him glance once across the room. Lettuce looked away quickly, too quickly, because when she looked back, he was still looking. Not at Daphne, who had positioned herself at a perfectly calculated distance from Bastwick. Not at the daughters of the 3 earls who had arranged themselves near the center of the room, like a painting composed specifically to be noticed. He was looking at the edge of the room, at the marble column, at the girl standing beside it, with folded hands and a gown that was 3 seasons behind the current fashion. Lettuce told herself it meant nothing. People looked at things all the time without meaning anything. She turned her attention to the refreshment table and considered whether moving toward it would look purposeful or desperate. She decided to stay where she was. Countess Henwick appeared at her left shoulder without warning. "You are standing like a servant," she said, quietly enough that no one nearby could hear. Sharp enough that Lettuce felt it in her back teeth. "Straighten your shoulders and move away from that column. You look like you are hiding." "I am not hiding," Lettuce said. "Then stop looking like you are." The Countess swept away before Lettuce could respond, already moving toward a cluster of titled women near the center of the floor, already smiling, the smile she reserved for people whose opinions she needed. Lettuce straightened her shoulders. She stepped away from the column and nearly walked directly into the Duke of Greyfeld. He caught her before she stumbled, one hand briefly steadying her arm, and then released her the moment she was balanced, which was the correct and proper thing to do. Up close, his face was harder to read than it had looked from across the room. There were lines near his eyes that had not been there 4 years ago, or so she imagined, having never actually seen him 4 years ago. There was something behind his expression that she could not immediately name, something careful, something watching. "Forgive me," Lettuce said, "because someone had to say it first." "The fault was mine," he replied. His voice was level. Not warm, not cold, simply steady in the way that deep water is steady. I was not watching where I was going. This was plainly untrue, because he had been walking in a perfectly direct line, and she had stepped into his path, but she was not going to argue the point. She gave a small nod, the kind that was meant to close the conversation politely, and prepared to move in a different direction. "You were standing near the column," he said, before she could take the step. She paused. I was, for most of the last half hour. She turned back to look at him fully, because that was a strange thing to say, and it deserved a direct response. You were counting? Something shifted at the edge of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape a smile makes when someone is deciding whether or not to let it happen. Observing, he said, there is a difference. Lettice looked at him for a moment. Is there? She said. It was not really a question. This time, the almost smile became slightly more definite. You are Miss Lettice Harrow, he said, daughter of the late Earl Henwick. Stepdaughter, she corrected, because she always corrected it. Her father had been the Earl. She was his daughter by blood. The Countess was the step, not her. People constantly inverted this, and it had stopped irritating her only slightly. Stepdaughter, he repeated, without any particular emphasis, as if he was simply updating information. I am Greyfeld. I know who you are, Letty said. Everyone in this room knows who you are. You have been the primary subject of conversation in this county for the past 2 weeks. He looked at her with an expression she could not read at all. And what have they been saying? That you are rich, unmarried, and overdue for a wife. She said it plainly because it was plain fact, and she had not yet decided to be careful with this man. Every family with a daughter present tonight is here because of you. Including yours? The question landed simply and directly, and Lettice felt the edges of it. My stepmother is here because of you, she said. I am here because I had no sufficient reason not to be. The Duke of Greyfeld looked at her for a long moment with that careful, unreadable expression, and then said, That is the most honest answer I have received tonight. Lettice did not know what to do with that, so she said nothing. Across the room, Daphne had spotted them. Lettice could see it in the way her stepsister's posture changed, the tiny stiffening of the spine, the recalibration of direction. Lord Bastwick had seen it too, and was watching with open curiosity and something that looked very close to amusement. The Duke did not turn around to follow her gaze. Will you walk with me? He asked. Around the room, nothing more than that. Lettice considered this for 3 full seconds. People will talk, she said. People are already talking, he replied. She could not argue with that either. They walked the perimeter of the ballroom at a pace that was slow enough to be deliberate and public enough that no one could misread it. Lettice was aware of every eye in the room tracking their movement. She was aware of Lady Pembroke, the younger, frozen mid-sentence at the far end of the room, watching with an expression caught between delight and confusion. She was aware of her stepmother, who had gone very still in the middle of her conversation with the titled women, and was staring with a look that Lettice had never seen on her face before. It was not anger. It was something more unsettled than anger, something that looked almost like recalculation. And she was aware of Daphne, who had stopped moving entirely. The Duke spoke first. How long have you been in the county? I have always been in the county, Lettice said. My father's house is 3 miles from here. I grew up in it. I meant since the mourning period ended. She glanced at him sideways. 2 seasons, she said. This is my 3rd. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already considered. You do not enjoy these events. I did not say that. You did not have to. Lettice looked straight ahead. The orchestra was playing something bright and fast now, and the couples on the floor moved through it with rehearsed elegance. She watched them for a moment before she answered. I do not dislike them, she said carefully. I dislike what they require of me. And what do they require? Performance, she said. They require me to be something specific, palatable, unthreatening, easy to dismiss but memorable enough to be chosen. She stopped for a moment, surprised at herself. She had not planned to say any of that. It has come out the way things come out. When a person has been holding them in long enough, that any small opening becomes an exit. The Duke was quiet for a beat. That is a precise description of something most people pretend does not exist. Most people have more to lose by admitting it, Lettice said. He looked at her then, not the sideways observational glance she had caught twice already, but directly with the full weight of his attention. It was not an entirely comfortable feeling. It was the feeling of being genuinely seen by someone who was very good at seeing and had decided to use that ability on you specifically. "Your stepsister is watching us," he said. "My stepsister has been watching us since the moment you stopped to speak to me," Lettice said. "She prepared for 6 days to be noticed by you tonight. She will be trying to understand what happened." "What happened?" he asked. Lettice turned to look at him directly now, because the question was too deliberate to answer while looking away. "I genuinely do not know," she said. "You tell me." He did not answer immediately. They had completed nearly half the room's perimeter, and Lettice became aware that the whispers had not faded behind them. They had grown. The quiet current she had felt when she first entered the room had shifted into something with more texture, more speculation, more weight. Lord Bastwick had moved to a better vantage point. Lady Pembroke had leaned toward another woman and was speaking quickly behind her fan. The Duke of Greyfeld moved through all of it without altering his pace by a single step. "My mother wrote to me twice before she passed," he said, in a tone that was still level, but carried something new in it. Something chosen carefully and placed deliberately. Both letters mentioned the same family. Not the Countess Henwick. Not the daughters she managed like investments. The Earl's daughter by blood. She said she was composed. She said she was honest. She said she was the kind of person you could trust in a room full of people who were performing. Lettice felt something land in her chest that she did not have an immediate name for. "I never met your mother," she said. "She met you once," he said. "At a charity function 3 years before she died. You were 14. She said you sat with an elderly widow for 40 minutes, rather than joining the other children, because the widow looked lonely, and no one else had noticed." Lettice remembered the function. She did not particularly remember the widow. She had simply done what had seemed obvious at the time, which was sit with someone who was sitting alone. She had not thought of it as anything meaningful. She did not thought anyone had noticed at all. "She told you that story," Lettice said, and her voice was quieter now without her meaning it to be. "In both letters," he said. "The same story, 2 years apart." He paused. "She said she wanted me to find a woman like that, someone who did the right thing when no one was watching." The orchestra reached the end of its piece, and the room filled briefly with the sound of applause and shifting feet. In that small gap of noise, Lettice breathed carefully and tried to sort through what she was feeling and what she was supposed to be feeling, and whether they were anywhere close to the same thing. "You came back to find me," she said. It was not an accusation. It was not a question. It was just the shape of what she was understanding. "I came back because I had been away long enough," he said. "But yes, I wanted to see if she was right." "And?" Lettice asked, before she could stop herself. This time, the edge of a smile came fully, briefly, real enough to change his face in a way that made him look younger and entirely less composed. "And I have been standing in this room for 40 minutes, he said. "And you are the only person who told me the truth when I asked a direct question." Lettice looked away because she did not trust what her face might do if she kept looking at him. Across the room, her stepmother was now moving in their direction. Slowly, with the precision of someone who had made a decision and was executing it calmly. Daphne was beside her. "My stepmother is coming," Lettice said. "I know," he said. "She will want to introduce Daphne to you properly." "I know that too." Lettice stopped walking. They were near the far corner of the room now, close to a row of tall windows that let in the cold evening air from outside. She turned to face him fully. "Then I should step aside," she said, "before she arrives. It will be easier for everyone." The Duke of Greyfeld looked at her with that direct, full-attention gaze that she was already beginning to find difficult. "I do not want easy," he said quietly. "I have had it easy. Easy is why I stayed away for 4 years." She did not know what to say to that. She did not get the chance to find anything, because the Countess arrived, all warmth and practiced grace, with Daphne positioned just half a step behind her, like a portrait brought to life. "Your Grace," the Countess said, and her voice was everything polished and smooth. "What a pleasure to see you return to the county. Allow me to properly introduce my daughter, Miss Daphne Henwick. I believe you may have been briefly acquainted in previous seasons." The Duke turned to greet them with exactly the correct degree of courtesy. He was polished, he was appropriate, he said all the right things in the right order. Daphne smiled her most practiced smile. Lord Bastwick arrived within a minute, and the small group took on the shape of a proper social exchange, the kind that filled ballrooms and made matchmaking mothers feel that the evening had gone well. Lettice stepped back by instinct, creating the distance that situations like this required. And then the Duke said, without turning away from the Countess, without making it theatrical, without any indication that he had planned it, "Miss Harrow, you have not yet told me whether you prefer the early or later sets of the evening." Every word in the group stopped. The Countess's smile did not fall. It held perfectly in place. That was actually more telling than if it had fallen. Daphne's eyes moved to Lettice with an expression that was not quite hurt, and not quite fury, and landed somewhere more complicated than either. Lord Bastwick looked at the ceiling briefly, which was the closest he apparently came to showing surprise. Lettice met the Duke's eyes from her half-step back. His expression was entirely calm. He was waiting for her answer with the patient attention of someone who had asked a simple question and expected a simple answer, and was not particularly concerned about what it had just rearranged in the room around them. "The later sets," Lettice said. "The early ones are always too crowded to enjoy." "Then I will find you for the later sets," he said, and returned his attention to the Countess, as if nothing of particular note had occurred. But something of particular note had occurred. Everyone in that corner of the ballroom had felt it. And, by morning, everyone in the county would have heard some version of it. The Duke of Greyfeld had returned after 4 years of silence, walked into the most anticipated event of the season, spent 40 minutes in conversation with the overlooked stepdaughter of a late Earl, and then publicly reserved the later sets for her in front of her stepmother, and the stepsister every matchmaking mother had been preparing for exactly this moment. Lettice stood at her half-step back and kept her face composed, but her heart was doing something she could not afford to examine in a room full of people who were already watching. Outside the tall windows, the night was very dark and very cold, and somewhere in the distance, a carriage was moving fast down the county road toward the Henwick house, carrying a letter that no one in that ballroom yet knew existed. The letter arrived at the Henwick house before Lettice did. Mrs. Pottle, the housekeeper, had placed it on the hall table with the careful hands of someone who sensed, without being told, that the envelope carried trouble. It was sealed with black wax. The handwriting on the front was sharp and angular, the kind of writing that belonged to someone who had never once been asked to soften anything. It was addressed not to the Countess, not to Daphne, but to Lettice directly, using her full name and her father's title beneath it. Miss Lettice Harrow, daughter of the late Earl Henwick. When the carriage returned from Lady Pembroke's ballroom, it was the Countess who saw the letter first. She stood over it for a long moment without touching it. Then she called for her lady's maid and went upstairs without a word. Daphne did not go upstairs. Daphne sat in the parlour with her gloves still on and said nothing for several minutes, which was unusual enough that even the parlour maid slipped quietly out of the room to avoid whatever was building in the silence. Lettice picked up the letter, broke the seal, and read it standing in the hallway, with her coat still on, and the cold of the evening still sitting in her bones. It was from a solicitor in London, a man named Mr. Croft of the firm Croft and Aldgate, who wrote in the clipped and bloodless language of men who deliver significant information as if it were inventory. The letter stated that upon recent review of the late Earl Henwick's full estate documents, a secondary provision had been discovered in the original deed of the Henwick property. This provision, written in the Earl's own hand and witnessed by two parties, stated that should the estate pass beyond the direct bloodline, the eldest child of the Earl's blood had the right to contest the transfer and reclaim primary residency. Lettice read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Her father had written her a door, a legal, witnessed, documented door, and he had hidden it inside the estate deed, and no one had found it for 3 years because no one had been looking. The Countess had inherited the house, the income, the name, and the social position without challenge. And somewhere in a London office, a solicitor had just discovered that the late Earl had anticipated exactly this possibility, and had quietly, carefully done something about it. Lettice folded the letter and put it inside her coat. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her narrow room on the upper floor of the house her father had built, listening to the old timber settle and shift around her, and she thought about the Duke saying his mother had noticed her sitting with a lonely widow at a charity function. She thought about the way Lord Bastwick had looked at the ceiling when the Duke reserved the later sets for her. She thought about Daphne's face in the ballroom, that complicated expression that was not quite hurt and not quite fury. And she thought about the letter and what it meant and what it would cost her to use it. By morning, she had decided 2 things. The first was that she would travel to London to speak with Mr. Croft directly before she did anything else. The second was that she would tell no one in the Henwick house about the letter until she understood exactly what she was holding. She had not counted on Daphne. Daphne knocked on her door at 7:30 with 2 cups of tea, which was so far outside the established pattern of their relationship that Lettice opened the door slowly and looked at her stepsister for a moment before stepping aside to let her in. Daphne entered and set both cups on the small table near the window and sat down in the chair beside it with a composure that suggested she had rehearsed this visit. "I saw the seal on that letter," Daphne said. Lettice sat on the edge of her bed. "Did you? Black wax, Croft and Aldgate, I know that firm." Daphne wrapped both hands around her cup. "My mother used them when your father's estate was first transferred. They handled all the documentation." Lettice said nothing. "She does not know I know that," Daphne continued. "She does not tell me most things. She tells me what to wear and where to stand and which men to smile at. She told me for 6 days to be ready for last night, a pause that held more weight than Daphne's usual pauses, and then the Duke spent the evening talking to you." "Daphne," Lettice said carefully. "I am not angry with you," Daphne said, and her voice had a quality Lettice had never heard in it before, something stripped of its usual performance. "I want you to understand that. I am not angry with you. I am angry with a situation I did not choose and was not honest with me." Lettice looked at her stepsister, really looked at her, and saw something she had not allowed herself to see in 3 years of careful distance. Daphne was exhausted, not from last night, from a long time before last night. "She has been using you," Lettice said quietly. Daphne let out a breath that answered the question without using words. "Whatever is in that letter," she said, "I think you should use it. Whatever it gives you, I think you should take it." She stood, left her tea half finished, and moved to the door. Then she stopped. "He looked at you the way I have been hoping someone would look at me for 3 seasons, she said without turning around. "I do not know what to do with that yet, but I did not want to be your enemy over it." She left before Lettuce could respond. Lettuce sat with both cups of tea going cold on the table and felt the weight of the morning pressing down on her, with all its complicated and unexpected shapes. 3 hours later, she was in a hired carriage heading toward the London road. She had told Mrs. Pottle she was visiting a friend. Mrs. Pottle had looked at the small travelling bag in Lettuce's hand, and the careful blankness of her expression, and had said nothing except that she would leave the side door unlatched. The countryside moved past the carriage windows in the grey, early light. Lettuce kept the letter inside her coat the entire journey, one hand resting lightly over it as if it might disappear if she stopped holding it there. She did not know that another carriage had left the county road an hour before hers. She did not know that the Countess Henwick had sent an express rider to London the previous night, shortly after seeing the solicitor's seal on the hall table. She did not know that Mr. Croft had already received a visitor that morning, and she did not know that the Duke of Greyfeld had spent the night reviewing a set of documents his own solicitor had forwarded to him, documents that concerned the Henwick estate, a contested deed provision, and the question of who, legally, had the right to remain in a house that a dead Earl had built with his own money for his own daughter. Mr. Croft's office was on a narrow street off the Strand, sandwiched between a printer and a tea merchant, and it smelled like old paper and careful secrets. Lettuce arrived to find the door already open. Not the outer door. The inner office door, the one that was supposed to be closed during private consultations. It stood ajar by several inches, and from behind it came 2 voices, one of which she recognized immediately. The Countess. Lettuce stopped in the small waiting area and did not move. The clerk at the outer desk looked up at her with the expression of a young man who was acutely aware that something was happening that he had not been trained to handle. "She arrived an hour ago," he said very quietly. Lettuce looked at the inner door. "Is Mr. Croft speaking freely with her?" The clerk looked down at his desk, which was its own answer. Lettuce sat down in the hard wooden chair beside the window and waited. She was good at waiting. She had been waiting for 3 years in various forms. She folded her hands and kept her breathing even, and listened to the low movement of voices behind the door, without being able to distinguish words. 11 minutes later, the Countess emerged. She saw Lettuce immediately. Her face did not change in the way most people's faces change when they are caught somewhere they should not be. It rearranged. That was the difference with the Countess. She did not react. She recalculated. Her expression moved from whatever it had been inside that office to something composed and faintly cool, like a woman who has just finished a task and is mildly surprised to see you here, but not particularly concerned. "Lettuce," she said. "Stepmother," Lettuce replied. The Countess looked at the clerk, then back at Lettuce, then at the small travelling bag at Lettuce's feet. "You were faster than I expected," she said, which was not a denial of anything. It was almost an acknowledgement, almost a form of respect, delivered in the Countess's particular currency, which was never warmth and always precision. "What did you tell him?" Lettuce asked. "What was necessary?" the Countess said. She pulled on her gloves 1 finger at a time. "You should know, Lettuce, that I did not do any of this out of cruelty. Your father left a complicated situation, and I managed it the way I knew how. I had Daphne to consider. I had a household to maintain." "You had my father's house," Lettuce said, keeping her voice level. and his income, and his name. He gave them to me, the Countess said. Willingly. Whatever Mr. Croft has written to you, whatever provision your father buried in that deed, it does not change what was freely given. It changes what can be taken back, Lettice said. Something moved through the Countess's expression then, quick and deep, and Lettice recognized it as the first genuinely unguarded thing she had ever seen on her stepmother's face. It was not guilt. It was closer to the feeling of a woman who had built something carefully for years and was now watching a crack appear in its foundation. Be careful, the Countess said quietly, not as a threat, as information. There are people involved in this matter who are more powerful than either of us, and they have interests that have nothing to do with where you sleep at night. Then she walked out through the outer door and was gone. Lettice sat with that for a moment. Then she went into Mr. Croft's office. He was a small grey man who wore his anxiety visibly, like an extra layer of clothing. He rose when she entered and gestured to the chair across his desk, with the eagerness of someone who wanted very much to be done with the morning. Miss Harrow, he said, please. Lettice sat. Tell me everything she asked you to do, he told her. It took 12 minutes. By the end of it, Lettice understood that the Countess had not come to destroy the provision. She had come to delay it, to insert a counter-document into the process, a challenge to the witness signatures on the original deed, arguing that one of the two witnesses had since died, and the other had relocated to the continent, and could not be produced in a timely manner to confirm. This would not eliminate Lettice's claim. It would simply make it slow. Expensive, exhausting, the kind of legal process that drained a person of resources and resolve before it ever reached a conclusion. It was smart. Lettice had to admit it. It was thoroughly smart. Can the second witness be located? She asked. Mr. Croft opened a drawer and produced a separate document. I took the liberty, he said carefully, of already making inquiries. The second witness relocated to Lyon 18 months ago. He paused. However, he has a daughter in Hampshire. And that daughter has been in correspondence with my firm regarding an unrelated matter. Can she reach her father? Lettice asked. With the right letter and sufficient urgency, she said, within a fortnight. Then write it, Lettice said today. He nodded rapidly and began making notes. Lettice stood and moved to the window that overlooked the narrow street below. The city moved in its usual indifferent rhythm, carriages and vendors, and the grey London sky pressing down on everything without personal feeling. She thought about the Countess's warning. People more powerful than either of us, with interests that have nothing to do with where you sleep at night. She was still thinking about it when the outer door of the office opened. The clerk said something in a low voice. Footsteps crossed the waiting area with the even, unhurried pace of someone who was not uncertain about their welcome. The inner office door, which she had not closed behind her, opened the rest of the way. The Duke of Greyfeld walked in. Lettice turned from the window. Mr. Croft rose from behind his desk so quickly he knocked his inkwell sideways. The Duke steadied it with one hand without looking at it, keeping his attention on Lettice. You came to London, she said. I came to London, he agreed. How did you know to come here? My own solicitor has been watching this case for 3 weeks, he said. Your father's deed provision did not surface through accident, Miss Harrow. Someone found it and brought it forward. He paused. That someone was acting on my instruction. The room was very quiet. Lettice looked at him with the full attention she had been careful with the previous evening, and felt the careful framework of her understanding shift and resettle. You found it, she said. I found it, he said. 6 months ago, when I began reviewing the estate records of every family in the county whose situation seemed irregular. Your father's will had the provision, buried deep in the property deed, rather than the will itself. It would have been missed indefinitely in a standard review. "Why?" she asked. "Why were you reviewing estate records?" He crossed the room slowly and stopped at a reasonable distance. Not too close. Not the distance of a stranger. "Because my mother told me a story about a girl who sat with a lonely widow when no one was watching," he said, "and I came home to find out what had happened to her." Lettice felt the thing in her chest again, the one she had not been able to name in the ballroom, the one she had avoided examining in the room full of watching people. It was fuller now, more defined, more dangerous. "You should have told me," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to be certain of several things first. The deed provision was only one of them. And the others?" He looked at her steadily. "That you were who my mother said you were. Those 3 years in that house had not changed you into someone smaller than yourself." He paused. "It has not." Outside on the narrow London street, a carriage passed with unusual speed. The clerk in the outer office said something quietly alarmed. Lettice moved toward the window again and looked down. A man she did not recognize was standing on the pavement directly below, looking up at the building with the focused attention of someone who had been told exactly which window to watch. He was well dressed. He was not a solicitor, and he was not a tradesman, and he carried himself with the particular posture of a man who worked for someone powerful, and was comfortable with that arrangement. Lettice stepped back from the window. "Who is that?" The Duke moved beside her and looked down without moving the curtain. His jaw tightened slightly, which was the first time she had seen anything tight in his expression. "His name is Grout," he said. "He works for Viscount Aldgate." "Aldgate," Lettice repeated, and then the name landed fully. "The Aldgate in Croft and Aldgate." "The senior partner," the Duke said, "who is not, as it happens, a neutral party in this matter. He has a financial interest in the Henwick estate that predates your father's death by several years, a private lending arrangement. If your father's blood heir reclaims the primary residency and contests the estate transfer, that arrangement becomes visible to the courts." Lettice turned from the window to look at him. "My stepmother did not come here to protect her house," she said slowly. "No," the Duke said. "She came here because someone told her to. Someone who has much more at stake than a house." The man on the pavement below had not moved. Mr. Croft was holding his pen above his paper and not writing anything at all. Lettice stood in the middle of the room with a letter inside her coat and a legal claim in process, and a man beside her who had spent 6 months quietly arranging pieces of a situation she had not known was being arranged. And she understood with sudden sharp clarity that last night's ballroom had been the least complicated part of everything that was happening. "What do we do?" she asked. The Duke of Greyfeld looked at her with an expression that was not calm in the way his expressions usually were. It was something more deliberate, more decided. "We go back to the county," he said, "and we do not go separately." They did not leave through the front door. Mr. Croft, who had apparently survived enough difficult situations in his career to develop practical instincts about them, suggested the rear exit without being asked. It led through a storage room stacked with document boxes and out into a narrow service alley that smelled of coal and damp stone. A second carriage, which the Duke had arrived in, was waiting at the far end of the alley with a driver who did not ask questions and did not look surprised. Lettice climbed in without hesitation. She had crossed a line somewhere between the ballroom and this alley, and she was aware of it without being troubled by it. 3 years of standing at the edges of rooms and folding herself into shapes that made other people comfortable had not prepared her for any of this, and yet she felt, strangely, more herself in this alley than she had felt at any point in those 3 years. The Duke gave the driver a direction she did not fully catch, and the carriage moved. "Viscount Aldgate," Lettice said, as the narrow London streets began sliding past the window. "Tell me everything." The Duke settled into the seat across from her and told her. It took the better part of an hour. By the time he finished, the city had thinned at its edges, and the road had opened into the first stretches of countryside, and Lettice had a picture in her mind that was considerably larger and considerably darker than the one she had woken up with. Viscount Aldgate was 63 years old, titled and financially inventive in ways that the law had not yet caught up with. He had been lending money to struggling landed families for over a decade. Not through banks, not through any traceable institution, but through private arrangements documented only in his own records and those of his firm. The late Earl Henwick had borrowed from him 7 years before his death, a significant sum taken against the property, intended to cover debts accumulated through a series of failed agricultural investments. The Earl had repaid the principal before he died, but Aldgate had added terms to the original arrangement. Terms written in supplementary pages that the Earl had signed without fully understanding their implication. That gave Aldgate a residual claim on the estate's income for 20 years following the date of the loan. The Countess had known about this arrangement. She had known from the beginning, which was why she had cooperated with Aldgate's management of the estate quietly and without public complaint, receiving a comfortable income in exchange for ensuring that no one examined the original loan documents too closely. If Lettice's deed provision succeeded and the estate transfer was contested in court, those loan documents would become part of the legal record. Aldgate's residual claim would be examined. The supplementary terms, which several of his other arrangements also contained, would become visible. And Viscount Aldgate, who had built his financial position on the assumption that none of his private arrangements would ever reach a courtroom, would find himself in considerable difficulty. "He is not going to let this proceed quietly," Lettice said. "No," the Duke said. "He has already taken steps to discredit Mr. Croft's findings. He has a second solicitor preparing a challenge to the deed provision's validity on the grounds that the ink used in the supplementary pages is inconsistent with the document's original date." "Is that true?" Lettice asked. "It is not," the Duke said. "I have had the document examined independently. The ink is consistent. Your father wrote that provision the same week he wrote the original deed. Aldgate's challenge is fabricated." "Then we have that," Lettice said. "We have it," he confirmed. "But Aldgate has something too." He paused, and the pause had weight. "He has a letter, written by your father 3 months before his death. In it, your father expresses doubt about the provision and considers withdrawing it. The letter is unfinished. It was never sent. But Aldgate has it, and he intends to present it as evidence of your father's changed intention." Lettice was quiet for a moment. Outside, the countryside was fully present now, wide fields and low stone walls moving steadily past. "Where did he get it?" "From someone inside the Henwick house," the Duke said. "Someone who had access to your father's private correspondence in the weeks after his death." The implication was plain, and Lettice sat with it without flinching. Someone in her father's house had taken a private, unfinished letter from a dying man's desk and delivered it to a viscount who would use it to erase a protection her father had built for her. She thought about Mrs. Pottle leaving the side door unlatched. She thought about Daphne knocking on her door with 2 cups of tea and saying she did not want to be her enemy. She thought about the Countess pulling on her gloves in Mr. Croft's waiting room and saying it was not cruelty, it was management. "It was not Daphne," Lettice said. "I do not believe it was either," the Duke said, and Mrs. Pottle never would. No, they looked at each other across the carriage, and the answer sat between them without needing to be said aloud. There was one other person in that house, with access to the late Earl's private study in the weeks after his death. One person who had managed everything that followed with the precision of someone who had already read the room and chosen her position before the Earl's body was cold. Lettice looked out the window for a long moment. She was not always like that, she said finally, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. When my father first brought her home, she was different. Softer, maybe, or perhaps just more careful about showing it. Daphne was 8. I was 11. There was a period of perhaps 6 months where the house felt like it might become something new and not entirely bad. She stopped. The Duke did not rush her. He had that quality, she had noticed it twice now, of being able to hold silence without filling it, without making the other person feel that the silence needed to be resolved. Then, the money troubles started, she said, and she changed the way people change when they are frightened and will not admit it. She became a manager instead of a person. That does not excuse what she did, the Duke said. No, Lettice agreed, it does not, but I would rather understand it than simply hate it. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize as the one he wore, when she said something that confirmed a conclusion he had already reached. It was not smug. It was something quieter than that. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, almost like relief. The carriage slowed as it entered the county road, the familiar landscape of low hills and hedgerows closing in around them. They were perhaps 4 miles from the Henwick house, and 6 from the Greyfeld estate, and the afternoon light was already beginning to lose its confidence. "There is one more thing," the Duke said. Lettice turned from the window. "Lord Bastwick came to me this morning before I left for London," he said. "He had received a message, sent anonymously, claiming that I had made an offer to your stepmother for Daphne's hand before last night's event, and that my behavior at the ball was a deliberate humiliation of the Henwick family." He paused. The message was sent to 3 other people as well, Lady Pembroke, the county magistrate, and the editor of the London Social Register. Lettice felt the shape of it immediately. "Aldgate," she said, "almost certainly. It is a pressure tactic. If the story circulates that I behaved dishonorably, my testimony in any legal proceeding regarding the deed provision becomes easier to dismiss. It also isolates you socially. If the county believes you were part of a deliberate slight against the Henwick family, your standing is damaged before the case even reaches a court. And Daphne," Lettice said quietly, "her reputation is caught in it too." The Duke nodded, which means Aldgate is not simply protecting his financial arrangement. He is dismantling every supporting structure around you at the same time. The carriage turned onto the Henwick Drive without Lettice directing it to, which meant the Duke had already decided they were going there first. She noted this without objecting. "She was thinking about Daphne and 2 cups of tea, and I do not want to be your enemy." "Stop the carriage," she said. The Duke knocked on the roof. The carriage stopped. "There is someone we need before we go to the house," Lettice said. "Someone who knows more about Aldgate's arrangement with my stepmother than anyone else in this county, and who has been too afraid to say it." "Who?" the Duke asked. "My father's former land steward," she said, "Mr. Hapsley. He left the Henwick estate 8 months after my father died. My stepmother told everyone he had retired. He lives in the village now, above the draper's shop. He was present for every financial conversation my father had in the last 2 years of his life." The Duke looked at her steadily. "You have known about him." "I have known about him for 2 years," she said. "I did not have anything to offer him before. He is an old man, and he was frightened, and I could not protect him." She met the Duke's eyes directly. Can you protect him now? Yes, he said, without hesitation. Then let us go and find him. Mr. Hapsley opened his door on the second knock and went pale immediately. He was a slight, white-haired man in his late 60s, with the careful posture of someone who had spent decades being useful, and the eyes of someone who had spent the last 2 years being afraid. He looked at Lettice, then at the Duke of Greyfeld, standing one step behind her on the narrow staircase landing, and he gripped the doorframe with one thin hand. "Miss Harrow," he said. "Mr. Hapsley," Lettice said gently. "We need your help, and I promise you, on my father's name, that you will not be left alone in this." He let them in. The room above the draper's shop was small and clean, and arranged with the quiet precision of a man who had once managed a large estate and still applied that habit to whatever space he occupied. He sat across from them at a small table and folded his hands and looked at them the way a person looks when they have been waiting for a particular moment for a long time and are not entirely sure whether to feel relieved or terrified that it has finally arrived. He told them everything in 40 minutes. The loan from Aldgate had been larger than even the Duke's documents showed. There had been a second tranche, drawn 6 months after the first, which the Earl had taken under considerable pressure, and which Hapsley had advised him strongly against. The supplementary terms on both tranches contained a clause that Hapsley described in a low, steady voice as the most dishonest piece of legal language he had encountered in 40 years of estate work. The clause stated that in the event of the borrower's death, the residual income claim transferred not merely to the estate, but to the physical property itself, meaning Aldgate had not simply lent money to the Earl. He had written himself a slow, quiet, legal path to owning the Henwick house, outright if enough time passed and no one challenged it. He would have had the house within 3 more years, Hapsley said. Perhaps 4. The income draw was structured to look like a management fee. By the time anyone understood what had accumulated, it would have been too late to contest. "And my stepmother knew this when she inherited?" Lettice asked. Hapsley looked at his folded hands. "She was told on the day of the funeral," he said quietly. "Aldgate came to the house while the family was still in mourning. I was present. He told her the terms. He told her that if she cooperated, meaning she kept the arrangement private, and discouraged any review of the estate documents, he would guarantee her a comfortable income from the property for the duration of the arrangement." He paused. "She had no money of her own. She had Daphne. He had a house she did not technically own outright, and a financial arrangement she did not fully understand," she agreed. "She had no good choices," Lettice said. "She had one," Hapsley said. "She could have told you. You were 17. You had a legal father and his name and this provision in the deed that no one had found yet. If she had told you, you might have found it sooner. The room was very quiet." Lettice thought about 3 years of standing at the edges of ballrooms, 3 years of altered gowns and narrow rooms, and being moved through the county's social season like a decorative object that no one particularly wanted to display. She thought about all of it, and then she set it aside, deliberately and completely, because there was still work to do, and the light outside the draper's window was failing. "Will you sign a written account of what you have just told us?" the Duke asked Hapsley. "I will," Hapsley said. "I have been wanting to sign it for 2 years. I was simply waiting for someone who could make it count." "It will count," the Duke said. They left with Hapsley's written account folded inside the Duke's coat, the same way Lettice had carried her letter, and went directly to the Greyfeld estate rather than the Henwick house. Because the Greyfeld estate had 2 things the situation now required: a proper legal library and Lord Bastwick, who had apparently taken up residence in the Duke's study at some point in the day, and was discovered there, surrounded by documents and an expression of focused satisfaction. "I found the anonymous message's origin," Bastwick said, without looking up. "A courier hired from a posting house off the county road, paid in cash, described by the posting house clerk as a heavy-set man with a London accent, who arrived on horseback and left within the hour." He looked up. "The posting house is 4 miles from Aldgate's county property." "That places him in the county," the Duke said. "It places him in the county," Bastwick confirmed, and then he saw Lettice properly, for the first time since they had entered, and something in his expression shifted from efficient to something warmer and considerably more direct. "Miss Harrow," he said, "I owe you an apology." Lettice looked at him. "For what?" "For every evening I watched you standing at the edge of a room and did nothing about it," he said, simply and without elaboration. He then returned his attention to his documents, which Lettice found she rather liked about him. The next 2 hours moved fast. The Duke's solicitor, a serious young man named Mr. Fenwick, who arrived within 20 minutes of being sent for, reviewed Hapsley's account alongside the Duke's independent ink examination and Mr. Croft's original letter, and produced a clear, structured legal argument that Lettice could follow, and that, she could tell from the way Mr. Fenwick presented it, was solid enough to hold under pressure. Aldgate's fabricated letter, the unfinished one from her father, could be challenged directly. An unfinished letter expressing doubt was not a legal instrument. It was not signed. It was not witnessed. It was not a codicil. It was a private thought that a man had written and then not sent and not completed, which meant, in the eyes of the law, it expressed nothing final. Hapsley's account confirmed the fraudulent nature of the supplementary loan terms. The Duke's ink examination discredited Aldgate's challenge to the deed provision's validity. And the courier record from the posting house, combined with the anonymous messages sent to Lady Pembroke and the others, established a pattern of deliberate interference in a legal proceeding which was a separate matter entirely, and one that the county magistrate, who had himself received one of those messages, would find personally motivating. "We will file tomorrow morning," Mr. Fenwick said. "First thing," the Duke confirmed. Lettice stood at the edge of the Duke's legal library and looked at the assembled pieces of the thing that had been happening around her for 3 years without her knowledge, and felt something settle in her chest that she did not immediately recognize, because she had not felt it in a very long time. It was the feeling of ground beneath her feet, solid, specific, real, a knock at the study door. The Duke's housekeeper entered with a note on a small silver tray. The Duke read it. His expression shifted. "What is it?" Lettice asked. He handed it to her. It was from Daphne. Short, written quickly, the handwriting pressured and slightly uneven. It said, "She knows you went to London. She knows about Hapsley. Someone told her. She is sending for Aldgate tonight. Come before morning or it will be too late." Lettice folded the note. Bastwick was already on his feet. Mr. Fenwick was closing his documents with rapid hands. The Duke was looking at Lettice with an expression that asked a question without using words. "We go now," Lettice said. They arrived at the Henwick house as the last of the evening light was letting go of the sky. The house was lit from the inside, warm and golden through its tall windows, and it looked the way it had always looked from the outside, comfortable and settled and entirely itself. Lettice had grown up watching this house from every angle and distance. She knew the way it held light and the way it held silence, and she felt, walking toward it now, the full complicated weight of every year she had spent inside it. The front door opened before they reached it. Daphne stood in the doorway. Behind her, further back in the entrance hall, The Countess stood very still beside the fireplace with her hands clasped in front of her. She looked at the Duke, at Bastwick, at Mr. Fenwick with his document case, and then at Lettice, and her expression did not recalculate this time. It simply went quiet. "He is not here yet," Daphne said. "She sent for him an hour ago. He will come by the back road." She looked at her mother. "I sent the note because this has gone far enough." The Countess closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, she looked at Lettice directly. "What do you want?" she asked. And it was the most unguarded question she had ever asked in Lettice's presence. "I want my father's house," Lettice said. "And I want Aldgate stopped. Everything else we can discuss like people." Something moved through the Countess's face. It was not a relief, and it was not a defeat. It was something in the difficult space between them, something that belonged to a woman who had made hard choices in frightened circumstances, and had known, somewhere beneath all her careful management, that the account would come due eventually. "The back road," she said quietly. "He will come through the kitchen garden." Bastwick moved. He was out the side door and into the dark with two of the Duke's footmen, before anyone else had fully processed the information, and when Viscount Aldgate arrived through the kitchen garden gate, 20 minutes later with two men of his own, and a document case, and the assumption that he was arriving to resolve a situation privately, he found instead Lord Bastwick, a county magistrate, who had been summoned from 2 miles away, and the very inconvenient reality that his posting-house courier had been identified, his fabricated letter had been legally demolished, and his 40-year arrangement of quiet financial predation had just been fully documented and placed in the hands of people who were not afraid of him. Aldgate looked across the kitchen garden at the house, at the lit windows, at the figures visible inside, and for the first time, in what was probably a very long time, he had no recalculation available to him. Inside, the Countess sat down heavily in a chair near the fireplace, and did not speak for a long time. Daphne sat beside her, not touching, not comforting exactly, but present in the way that people are present when they have decided to stop pretending that a difficult thing is not happening. Lettice stood at the window and watched Lord Bastwick manage the scene in the kitchen garden, with the competence of a man who had clearly done something like this before and found it satisfying. She felt the Duke come to stand beside her. Not too close, exactly the right distance, the distance of someone who understood that this moment belonged to her and was not trying to occupy it. "It is over," she said. "The legal part," he said. "The rest takes longer." She looked at him sideways. "The rest?" He looked back at her with an expression that was not the careful, unreadable one from the ballroom, and not the decisive one from London, but something newer and quieter, and entirely without performance. "You once told me people at these events required you to be palatable and easy to dismiss," he said. "I want you to know that I have found you to be the least dismissible person I have encountered in 31 years. Lettice looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the kitchen garden was being efficiently managed. Inside, a complicated family was sitting together in its difficulty. The legal library at the Greyfeld estate held documents that would be filed in the morning and would change the shape of her life before the week was finished. She thought about all of it, and then she said, quietly, so that only he could hear, "You'll regret choosing me. I have no fortune, a contested house, a difficult family situation, and I just helped dismantle a Viscount's financial empire in the course of a single day." The Duke of Greyfeld looked at her steadily, and then he said what he said, simply, and without any of the careful composure she had been watching him maintain since the ballroom. "My only regret," he said, "is waiting so long." The fire in the hearth cast long shadows across the floor of the house her father had built for her, and outside, the county night settled over everything. Quiet and cold and full of the kind of stillness that follows when something that has been wrong for a long time finally completely comes right. Now, before we end this video, I have some questions for you. Daphne chose loyalty over resentment when it would have been so easy to choose the other direction. Do you think she deserved her own happy ending after everything her mother put her through? And what do you think that looked like for her? And the Countess, a woman who made terrible choices inside a frightened situation, did she earn any forgiveness by the end, or had she simply run out of options? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and tell us which wonderful part of the world you are watching from tonight, because this community stretches further than you know, and we love seeing where these stories land. If this journey, from that ballroom doorway to that kitchen garden window, moved something in you, please subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting, and you do not want to arrive late to them. I will be going through every single comment personally to reply, so leave your thoughts and let us continue the conversation.